You're listening to Life, the Universe, and Everything Else. Today on the show, Free Palestine.
Life, the Universe, and Everything Else explores the intersection of science and society. Original music is produced by Ian James, and this episode was edited by Marissa McCool. Find her on Patreon at patreon.com/QAF. Heads up before we start. We are talking about the history, politics, and current situation in Israel and Palestine. If that's not something that you are up to today, especially since this is our blanket trigger warning for basically everything, we understand if you give this one a miss.
My name is Jem Newman, and with me today I have Ashlyn Noble.
Hello.
Laura Creek Newman.
Hi there.
And Lauren Bailey.
Hello.
As long as this episode will inevitably be, and I imagine we're going to split it into a two-parter, everything we talk about here will necessarily be a brief summary. So I encourage our listeners to check out the show notes for sources, references, and further reading for everything we talk about today. In case any relevant news occurs in the days between recording, editing, and release of this episode is being recorded on the 28th of August, 2024, the day after a large incursion by the Israel Defense Forces into the West Bank that killed 10 people. So I'm going to start off by briefly sketching the situation, as far as is possible, in historic Palestine right now. On October 7th, 2023, at around 6:30 a.m. local time, during the Jewish holiday of Shemini Atzerat and Shimchat Torah, Hamas, a Palestinian political and military group, launched a surprise attack on the state of Israel. The attack began with a barrage of rockets fired from the Gaza Strip, an occupied Palestinian territory, into southern Israel. Shortly thereafter, Hamas fighters breached the security barrier and entered Israel. A group of Hamas militants opened fire on Israeli civilians attending the Supernova Sukkot gathering, an outdoor music festival near Kibbutz Reim, killing 364 people and wounding many more. 40 Israeli civilians were taken hostage during the music festival massacre. The Times of Israel reports that Hamas was unaware of the music festival when they initially planned the October 7th incursion into Israel. By 10 o'clock in the morning, fighting had spread to 3 Israeli military bases and several border towns, where additional hostages were taken by Hamas. By the evening, Israel reported that approximately 700 people had been killed in the attack, including both civilians and members of the military. Israel's Air Force had begun bombarding Gaza a little over 2 hours after the initial attack began, with blasts being heard starting around 9:45 in the morning, local time. Since the attack by Hamas, Israel has waged all-out war on occupied Gaza, killing more than 40,000 people, including hundreds of healthcare workers and journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists notes that this makes it the deadliest period for journalists anywhere in the world since they began gathering data. More than half of the buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed, including more than 300 schools. More than 649 healthcare facilities have been damaged, including 32 hospitals. While much international reporting has focused on the 251 hostages taken by Hamas during the October 7th attack, there has been substantially less coverage of the thousands of Palestinians who have been abducted by the IDF. After the attack, Israel abruptly cancelled the legal work permits of Palestinians in Israel and detained them without trial in prison camps. Speaking to The Independent, Dr. Nasri Abu Jaish reported that the Palestinian prisoners were being tortured. Quote, "They're beaten, and scarves are tied around their eyes, so they don't know where they are. Many of them are sick, and they don't give them medicine. They don't give them water or food. They're in open-air camps, and they aren't allowed to speak to each other. They broke one worker's jaw, another one his leg, another one his hands. I've met them in hospital." End quote. 2 weeks after the attack, more than 4,000 Gazans who had been working under legal permit in Israel were still missing. As Israel continues its attack on Gaza, more than 500 healthcare workers have been killed, and more than 300 more have been abducted by Israeli forces. There is substantial documentary and physical evidence that they have been tortured. I'll quote here from a report released this month, is August 2024, by Human Rights Watch. Quote, from March to June 2024, Human Rights Watch interviewed 8 Palestinian healthcare workers who were taken by the Israeli military from Gaza between November and December 2023 and detained without charge for between 7 days and 5 months. 6 were detained at work following Israeli sieges of hospitals or during hospital evacuations that they said had been coordinated with the Israeli military. None of the healthcare workers said they were ever informed of the reason for their detention or charged with any offense. Human Rights Watch also spoke with 7 people who witnessed Israeli soldiers detaining healthcare workers carrying out their duties. Released doctors, nurses, and paramedics described to Human Rights Watch their mistreatment in Israeli custody, including humiliation, beatings, forced stress positions, prolonged cuffing and blindfolding, and denial of medical care. They also reported torture, including rape and sexual abuse by Israeli forces, denial of medical care, and poor detention conditions for the general detainee population. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported on June 3 that the Israeli military was conducting criminal investigations into the deaths of 48 Palestinians in Israeli detention facilities since October 7th. These include Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, a surgeon and head of orthopedics at Al-Shifa Hospital, and Dr. Ayad An-Rantzitzi, the director of a women's healthcare center at Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Lahia. End quote. I will also note that I have personally spoken with several Canadian doctors who themselves witnessed evidence of torture while on medical missions to Gaza. A few of my friends are quoted in a Breach Media article that I will link to in the show notes. Much of the coverage of the ongoing conflict in historic Palestine frames this war as though it started with the October 7th attack. Indeed, I'm guilty of the same on this very episode. But history did not begin on October 7th. So let's talk about that history.
Starting about 400,000 years ago, archaic humans, various species of the genus Homo, lived in the Qasim cave near Kafr Qasim, in what is currently central Israel, about 15 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea. This cave contains some of the earliest evidence of humans having mastery over fire and bringing home their hunts regularly to butcher and cook them at home. Around 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer groups formed a permanent settlement that would come to be known as Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the world. Before continuous settlement, the first occupants of the site were there before agriculture was really a thing, and there were 2 whole different pre-pottery Neolithic societies that used the site.
Wow.
The area changed hands between many of the world's most well-known empires of history, including the pharaohs of Egypt, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Babylonians and Persians, Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Mamluks, and the Ottomans. We told you this would be a real quick overview, right?
That's a lot of empires.
They
I'm
went
just going to
through
throw
some
that
things.
out there.
They are basically at the armpit of 3 continents.
The armpit. Oh.
It's right where it folds.
I get it, but it's I'm sorry. Very unfortunate word choice. Nexus.
Apologies.
Nexus.
Yes.
Armpit of 3 continents.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, I get what they're saying.
It's beautiful. This is not a dig.
I am not anti-armpit. Armpits can be beautiful. In any case. Sorry.
It's beautiful.
I'm just, okay, whatever. The armpit thing, I can't.
Okay, we could cut that out.
My turn to derail things.
All right. Whew. In 1917, the Jewish population of the area was between 5 and 6%, and the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. But everybody was living in relative peace with their neighbors as far as those things go. The Ottoman Empire was decent at being like, hey, we're in control now. Give me your taxes. Do whatever you want. Just don't revolt or bother us in any way. So that was kind of the status quo for quite a few years. They had control over the region for about 1500s till the 1900s. After World War I, the British, having conquered the area, took over control of Palestine under what was called British Mandatory Palestine. And around this time, the concept of Palestine as a nation and as a people was really starting to coalesce. There were newspapers called, and I can't figure out whether this is pronounced just Palestine or Philistine, as it is spelled, but there was a newspaper with that title that really sort of brought people together and created community around the concept of that as a place and a nation. But at the same time, Zionism was really gaining steam. Jewish folks wanted, understandably, after centuries of pogroms and being expelled from various places around the world, somewhere that they could live where they couldn't be pushed out of. And many of the big Zionist thinkers saw Palestine as a perfect fit for a majority Jewish state. And in the early 1900s, settler colonialism was very in. It was very in favor. It was happening all over the world. Nobody in power really looked down upon it. It wasn't a bad word.
Right.
It was just a cool thing that you could do as a country to spread your shit around.
Find some space, take it.
Yeah.
I'm sure it wasn't cool with the people on the land being settled and colonized, but
They were not the people with the power.
People in power. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Europeans saw themselves as better than others, and they had no problem taking over other people's lands. It was a good thing. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour stated in a letter to British Jewish community leader Walter Lord Rothschild that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Oh, how did that work out? So they were throwing their might and their power behind the idea that, yes, Jewish people should have a state and it should be in Palestine. And try not to do anything to the people that live there, but there's probably nobody there anyway, was kind of the view, despite the hundreds of thousands of people who had lived there for centuries.
Yes. The people that have continuously been living there, and also presumably that the British are controlling presently.
Yes. Yeah, they were under their control at the time.
So it's it's empty, except for all these people that we make do what we want to do.
Yeah.
Cool. And just to be clear, the thinkers thinking of this homeland in Palestine for Jewish folks were typically European?
Oh,
American?
yes. Yeah. European and American. There were a few big thinkers, but I'm really bad at names, so I left most of them out.
That's okay. I think just thinking to people from very powerful places at the time.
The folks who were setting out to make Israel, what eventually becomes known as Israel, were not ignorant of what they were doing. Some of them were good at the words to make it seem like they were trying to do the right thing. But people like revisionist Zionist Zev Jabotinsky was one of the more frank, I guess, letter writers of the time. And we have quotes from him like, in 1923, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." That's pretty clear.
And that was written when?
1923.
100 years ago.
Yeah.
It could be written today.
Yep. Another quote from Jabotinsky. "Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach."
Ooh.
So take people away out of their home so that we can live there is the goal, and not let them come back, because otherwise they will never give up.
Sounds a little familiar here in Canada.
Yeah.
Right? This continued for quite some time with more and more immigration from Europe of Jewish people and more sort of overt understanding on both sides that the goal was to take over the land and create a Jewish state. The Great Palestinian Revolt from 1936 to 1939 was sparked by this growing understanding that the goal of mass migration to the area was to drive out the Arab population and establish the State of Israel. The Americans and the Soviets both had really good reasons for supporting the creation of Israel in Palestine.
Wait, can we put some air quotes around that? Really good?
Quote unquote, good political reasons. Among them, guilt, for sure. Because, of course, right after this time period, after the Great Palestinian Revolt, there is the Second World War and the Holocaust. Many countries around the world refuse to admit any people who are fleeing the Holocaust. They get murdered by the millions, and there is a lot of worldwide guilt floating around that they have done nothing with when presented with the same opportunities over and over again.
And I'm sure a lot of it was just plain old anti-Semitism too.
Oh, certainly, sure.
Yeah, not all altruistic.
Right. Like in the States, they didn't want to take any Jewish adults because they would take people's jobs, right? So, well, at least maybe let's let in the children was sort of the thought of some progressive people. And so there was a big to-do, and the compromise in the end was that the States would let in 10 Jewish children per month.
Great.
Yeah.
That's definitely going to help the millions that are in actual danger.
Yeah. Like
right
for those 120 children a year, amazing.
Yeah. Like,
wow.
100%. But wow, when you could take so many more and also have families.
Yeah.
Like whole families that could be well and actually support your economy overall, because generally that's what happens when more people come. But I digress.
And parents were willing to ship their children across the ocean without them to give them a chance.
How, like, as a parent, just thinking of that, it's...
How things have to be pretty dire.
It has so dire to say, this is my best hope, and it's slim.
Yeah.
Yeah. And these kids were most likely subsumed into the waspy Christian culture.
Many of them, sure.
Yeah.
But I mean...
But that's so, yeah, like, no kidding, there's guilt. You could have done so many things, and you used an American example, but Canada was just as bad.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
Worse.
And exactly. And the European countries where many of these folks lived had been horrible to Jewish folks for so long.
And that guilt did not last long enough to do anything about the situation now, because as we stand now, there are hundreds of families who would like to come to Canada from Gaza, and they cannot because of ridiculous bureaucracy. Like, well, you have to go to a consulate to get all your paperwork done. Where am I going to go to a consulate in fucking Gaza? There isn't one, and they're not allowing anyone out.
Yeah.
It's an impossibility.
Yeah.
So saying, oh, we'll take them as long as you get your paperwork done is just a ridiculous loop of red tape. Anywho, so the Holocaust was bad. We're just trying to say, let's not genocide anyone. The genocide. So the genocide of the Jewish people happens in the Second World War. And then the drive to create a Jewish state, of course, is at an all-time high. In 1948, the territory of Palestine is partitioned into Arab and Jewish states by the UN. This proposal gives about 55% of the land to the Jewish folks who at the time owned about 6% of the land. So they were getting a huge land transfer. This required, of course, that 750,000 people be dispossessed of their homes, with most fleeing under the threat of bombardment or being rounded up and shot. In some cases, like in Deir Yassin, they were massacred. And this is a story I didn't know, so I went down a little bit of a horrible rabbit hole. In April of 1948, Zionist militant groups wanted the town, not only because it was prosperous and had many goods they needed, like fuel and food and cattle, but also because it was strategically important. And if they could send a message at the same time that folks should get out of their houses before they were taken out, then great. They attacked in the early morning hours and went house to house with grenades and machine gun fire. About a quarter of Deir Yassin's population was murdered outright, and some were captured and paraded through West Jerusalem before being killed. News of this massacre was spread widely, accelerating the expulsion and flight of Palestinians from their homes, terrified that their village would be next. I wanted to talk a little bit about Deir Yassin's relationships with the towns around them before the massacre. When summoned before the Arab Higher Committee to explain his village's relationship with the Jews in January of that year, just months before the attack, the leader of the town, their Mukhtar, explained that they lived in peace with their neighbors. Deir Yassin's Arab residents had long coexisted with their Jewish neighbors, who lived in a town less than a kilometer away called Givat Shaul. Their village leaders had recently met amid the growing tensions and agreed to a peace pact, using signals like laundry lines and lanterns to warn the Jews of Palestinian patrols and granting safe passage to each other's residence. The Mukhtar was not asked to cancel the peace pact at this meeting and repeatedly declined offers to have militiamen guard their community. They just wanted to be left alone to raise their families and their sheep and care for their neighbors like most people do. So they were just two towns coexisting together, and that was not enough. 1 month later, Israel declared its independence and was immediately at war with its neighbors. By the end of the 1948 Israeli-Arab War, Israel controlled 78% of former mandatory Palestine. They hadn't declared their borders in their Declaration of Independence, stating that since the Arabs hadn't agreed to the partition, why should they hamper themselves by agreeing to only just over half the land? Another fun fact I learned is that they came this close to naming their country Palestine. They refrained from doing so because they assumed that the Arab state that would obviously be made soon after would be called Palestine, and they didn't want to confuse things. So they went with Israel. Instead, 750,000 Palestinians were driven out and relegated to tiny strips of land, tents on the beach, and refugee camps in Gaza and the West Bank, which were now held by Jordan and Egypt. Any Arabs left in the new state of Israel found themselves under martial law, and property of not only anyone who had left, but also anyone who remained, was divvied up and given away as the exclusive domain of Jewish people. In 1949, the Resolution 194 was passed at the UN, which calls for the right of return for anyone who left and wants to return, and for paying restitution to Palestinians who do not wish to return. This was and continues to be totally ignored by Israel, who was also accepted as a UN nation that year, whereas Palestine's recognition as a full member has been consistently blocked by the U.S.
And Canada.
Sure, but U.S. is the important member in that equation.
Yeah.
Canada doesn't have veto.
Yeah, not a permanent member of a Security Council.
In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel claimed the remaining Palestinian territories, plus the Golan Heights and Sinai Peninsula, which at that point were held by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and began building settlements in those lands. There have been a series of uprisings by the Palestinian people, sometimes called intifadas, wherein people who have had their homes and sacred spaces taken away and who have been sequestered in a tiny portion of their former homeland with fewer human rights than their colonist replacements have attempted to fight back. The response from Israel has not been any kind of reasonable or proportionate, of course. For example, in the first intifada, when protesters were engaging in graffiti, refusal to pay taxes, refusal to work in Israeli settlements, and throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at Israeli infrastructure and occupying soldiers, Israel deployed 80,000 soldiers in response. And typically the ratio of casualties between the two sides is worse than 10 to 1.
In favor of Israel.
Sure,
So 10 Palestinians at least for each one Israeli. Ashlyn, were you going to mention the meaning of the word intifada?
Oh.
Just for context for our listeners, the word intifada just means resistance or uprising. Right.
Oh, sorry, I even had the word uprising in there, but didn't.
Because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, so just for context, it's important to know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean like war, or it means resistance to oppression.
There have also been many attempts at peace talks, some of the most famous of which are the Camp David Accords and the Oslo Accords, which gave Palestinians some limited self-rule in the occupied territories. In 2006, elections were held in Palestine. Hamas, internationally recognized as a terrorist organization, won 74 of the 132 seats, rocking politics internationally.
Israel... So shocking.
Israel and the U.S. attempted to sanction the Palestinian government, such as it was, into oblivion in order to force new and different elections, but they failed. And after 2 years and a battle, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, while rival party Fatah retained control of the West Bank. This was the last time there have been elections, and due to the century of displacement and genocide, the population of Gaza is extremely young, and something like 3/4 of the population of Gaza currently didn't even have the chance to vote for the current government. Again, this is the tiniest overview of the tiniest fraction of important events in the history of the land of Palestine. But one of the podcasts that I was listening to put it this way: it's like one of those brain exploding diagrams where you're taught in school, like, yeah, it's complicated. And then you read about it and you're like, no, Palestine is right. There's nothing complicated about this. And then you just like keep reading and you're like, okay, it's like Palestine is right, but it's complicated.
It is complicated, but not so complicated that we can't see the path.
Yeah, like it's a simple case of settler colonialism and genocide. But it's also complicated. And there's a lot of history there.
There's a lot of history, and the surrounding geopolitical climate and atrocities and that really do complicate it. Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at it as just the facts, it's like, yeah, this is settler colonialism, just like in a lot of other places. And the groups involved had a lot going on and a lot of terrible things done to them all around.
Yeah.
Did you all see that video going around past couple days of they're interviewing an American settler in occupied Palestinian territory who was talking about how settler colonialism gets a bad rap these days?
Oh, no.
Oh, like a young person?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, is it that one guy?
No.
There's like a guy who is really pro, like, yeah, we're going to keep building settlements and just stealing people's land. And he's very American.
Yeah, it's like the policy of much of Israel is like, yeah, we're just going to keep taking it until everything is gone. They're not quiet about it, is the thing. Sorry.
I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and up until probably about 10 years ago, I was under the impression that the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was like, I mean, it was terrible. It was awful, and it did curtail any sort of peace at the time. But, I mean, so did Yasser Arafat with denying the solution that came up, and Rabin did some bad stuff too. He wasn't as peaceful as he was portrayed in the media that I was...
Again, I don't know names, so I have no idea what you're talking about.
They were the Prime Minister of Israel in the 90s during the Camp David Accords was Yitzhak Rabin, and Yasser Arafat was the leader of the Palestinians.
I know Yasser Arafat's name. Like, that's kind of seared into my mind. I didn't know Yitzhak Rabin, but I remember Netanyahu from when I was little. Like, he was the first Israeli politician that I knew of. And I remember just like learning that Arafat bad, Netanyahu good. Like, this is what I learned as a child. And yeah, and again, I don't know the full amount, but I do know enough to be like, I think it's more complicated, as Ashlyn said. But people are neither wholly good or wholly bad. And especially when there are high tension situations like this, there is going to be bad, harmful things happening on most sides.
But most of the people who live there still just want to live in peace with their neighbors.
Yeah.
That's all most people want.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think this is, I appreciate you framing that and giving that perspective. That's one village or two villages that found a way to say, hey, we're neighbors on this chunk of this planet. Let's kind of get along, right? We don't need to be best buds, but we can get along. But I think that's, and so is it like that everywhere? No. I mean, we know lots of places that aren't. However, the portrayal that there has always been this terrible feud between different groups of ethnic background, like from time immemorial, is not necessarily true either.
And it's frequently portrayed as though it is a religious conflict. And it never seems that way when you look at the details. It seems like a conflict centered, and I'm not trying to get all Marxist here, but centered on material conditions.
Like the availability of space and
Yeah. And people being expelled from their historic homeland, people coming back to an area that they have long viewed as their historic homeland and taking it from the current occupants.
And something that was stressed a lot in many of the things I read was that before all of the sort of expansionism and attempts at colonialism, the people who would visit places like Jerusalem to be in the Holy Land and visit and study and even move there to live and die there, they were welcome. And there were Hasidic and Ashkenazi communities there. It could have continued that way.
Speaking of people who just want to live their lives, here's how some can't.
We focused a lot on the situation in Gaza and Palestine's history as a whole, but now we're going to turn briefly to look at the West Bank in particular, I think.
Mm-hmm. And a little bit of Gaza.
Okay.
They're both the same. They're not both the same. They're both the same on this topic. So I'm going to talk about apartheid. Starting the segment with the definition of apartheid seems a bit trite, but I want to make sure that we are on the same page, both us at this table and our listeners. Apartheid is, no surprise, an Afrikaans word meaning to set apart, and is exclusively applied to setting apart people based on racial, ethnic, or religious criteria. The 1973 United Nations International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid defines the crime of apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Apartheid is set out as a crime against humanity in both the 1973 UN Convention I mentioned and again in the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. There are three primary elements of apartheid. It is an intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another, and racial in this case does not just mean skin color or genetic traits. It is a context of systematic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. And it is inhumane acts such as forcible transfer and expropriation of landed property. And all of the associated horrendous acts that go with that. Ashlyn has just given us a detailed history of the situation between Palestine and Israel, so I'm trying my best to limit my segment to the current situation. I went into this research thinking that I had a better grasp on the situation than the average North American, and while that may be true, holy shit, I thought I knew, but I barely know anything.
That's the true mark of the scholar, right? You reach that point where you're like, I know nothing.
A little peek behind the pod. We were supposed to record last night, and all of us went, no, there's
not
too
yet.
Too much.
More reading to do.
Yeah, when you texted me earlier, like, I thought I knew, but I did not. I was like, yeah, I learned some things. We were doing this research.
And no matter how long I talk on this segment, and because everybody's segment is very charged, I'm trying to keep mine very short. I won't be able to cover everything regarding the apartheid state or status, so I'm just going to touch on a few main points. And as Ashlyn was saying about that village, please remember that what I'm talking about are the effects on the civilian population and not just the militants in their midst. Let's start with the actual physical barrier. The West Bank barrier was built by Israel along the Green Line, which is the armistice line established in 1949, and it's also built in parts of the West Bank. It was first proposed in 1992 by Yitzhak Rabin to keep the population separate and to prevent Palestinian political violence. This was because there was a small Palestine insurgency that killed one Israeli girl. According to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, quote, the separation barrier built by Israel snakes its way through the West Bank, isolating Palestinians from each other, from their land, work, schools, and healthcare. The wall confiscates significant amounts of land and annexes more land to Israel, as Ashlyn was mentioning. The court said, The construction of the wall being built by Israel, the occupying power, in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in and around East Jerusalem and its associated regime, are contrary to international law. End quote. Israel is under an obligation to make reparation for all damage caused by the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in and around East Jerusalem. That was another quote from there. Sorry. The court also noted that significant amounts of the West Bank are, de facto, annexed by the wall.
Mm-hmm.
In a 2005 report, the United Nations stated that it's difficult to overstate the humanitarian impact of the barrier. The route inside the West Bank severs communities, people's access to services, livelihoods, and religious and cultural amenities. In addition, plans for the barrier's exact route and crossing points through it are often not fully revealed until days before construction commences. This has led to considerable anxiety amongst Palestinians about how their future lives will be impacted. The land between the barrier and the Green Line constitutes some of the most fertile land in the West Bank. It is currently the home for 49,400 West Bank Palestinians living in 38 villages and towns. So it's good land.
Mm-hmm.
And unsurprisingly, we're saying this is a material war. It's good land.
Well, if I could build on the line over here, but these few kilometers are a little bit more fertile, why don't I just move it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then once it's built, I mean, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's to say that it is not a systematic plan, and especially with giving no notice and allowing, like, purposely dividing communities, like historic community linkages. And I might be wrong, but there's also some reports that it preferentially allows linkages for, like, Israeli settlements in some places as well, is pretty clear.
Yeah. After 1977, the military government in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the WBGS, confiscated and enclosed Palestinian land and allowed the transfer of Israeli settlers into these occupied territories. Settlers continued to be governed by Israeli law, and a different system of military law was enacted to regulate the civilian, economic, and legal affairs of the Palestinian inhabitants. So the Palestinians are under Israeli military law, and the Israeli people have a civilian law.
Okay, so two different systems
Yeah.
in the same physical space for two different groups of people who are all technically under the same, or like, yeah, okay.
It's by the same power, but
different based on who you are.
Turning to water, the World Bank found in 2009 that Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which is about 15% of the population there, are given access to over 80% of its freshwater resources, despite the fact that the Oslo Accords call for joint management of such resources. This has created, according to the World Bank, a real water shortage for the Palestinians. And Laura, I believe you're going to be speaking more about that, about the food and water shortages. So
I will.
I took out a whole bunch of my research because I realized you were doing that segment.
I started typing. I was like, oh no, is this another feng shui episode? I was like, oh, I should check with Lauren.
Well, I had to keep checking in with Ashlyn because so much is historic. And I didn't want to step on Ashlyn's segment.
I did tell you it was going to be the briefest of overviews.
So let's look at the current state. After the 1967 war, Israel began building Israeli civilian settlements on Palestinian lands, eventually building over 200 settlements throughout the occupied territories and settling over 450,000 Israeli civilians in them, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians from their own legally owned lands. In addition, Israeli citizens lived in hundreds of Israeli settlements on occupied land not originally given to them in the UN partition plan, displacing hundreds of thousands of more Palestinians. These Palestinians are not given the right to return and reclaim the land. I think Ashlyn mentioned that as well. Israel is not giving them the option to come back and getting the land that either was taken from them personally or from their grandparents.
And this is, so referring to that, this means that they are supposed to, but they're not doing it, or they're not entitled to.
No, so there's been resolutions every year that have been reaffirmed at the UN that are like, yeah, Israel, give Palestinians their shit back, please. And Israel's like, nah. And so their justifications is alternately, we don't want to. And well, if we were going to give them their stuff back, then we'd have to charge them for everything the war has cost us.
Yeah.
The war that they didn't want to fight in the first place. That's not how it works. Like, that, no, no, that's not.
Some very special reasoning going on.
You'll hear the term right of return. And that's what it
right of return is also the
Israeli coming over too.
Yeah, it's a very...
Only certain people have the right of return.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, okay. That's not true. That's not true. And also, yeah.
Israeli authorities demolish hundreds of Palestinian homes and other structures every year. And they demolish them by saying this lacked a building permit. But the building permits are made nearly impossible by the Israeli authorities for Palestinian people to obtain.
It's the whole go to the consulate, but there isn't one.
Yep. And if the consulate is behind a 6-hour car trip with 8 different barriers, checkpoints that you have to get through, how can you get there? Between 2016 and 2018, Israeli authorities issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians living in the West Bank under Israel's control. In 2007, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination reported that Palestinians and Israeli settlers in the occupied territories are subject, as I said, to different criminal laws, and leading to longer detention and harsher punishment for Palestinians for the same offenses. Amnesty International has reported that in the West Bank, Israeli settlers and soldiers who engage in abuses against Palestinians, including unlawful killings, they enjoy impunity from punishment and are rarely prosecuted. But Palestinians detained by Israeli security forces may be imprisoned for prolonged periods of time, and there are, as Jem had said before, reports of torture and other ill treatment. And these are not credibly investigated by the authorities in the region. Palestinians living in non-annexed portions of the West Bank do not have Israeli citizenship or voting rights in Israel, but they are subject to movement restrictions by the Israeli government. Israel has created roads and checkpoints, as I said, in the West Bank, with the purpose of preventing the uninhibited movement of suicide bombers and militants in the region. And it has done that, but it has also curtailed the movements of the average Palestinian people.
I feel like has created roads doesn't really paint a picture of the weird little islands of settlements that Palestinians are allowed to live in. The series of maps over time of Palestinian territory is a good GIF you can look up.
Mm-hmm. One of my show notes has graphs over the last 100 years of where Palestinians are allowed to have freedom of movement and how they can move goods into and out of their settlements. I'll finish here by saying the human rights non-government organization B'Tselem has indicated that some Israeli policies around the curtailing of Palestinian people are based on the principle of separation through discrimination, and they bear striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime that existed in South Africa until 1994. So yes, Israel is an apartheid state for the Palestinian people, and as with everything we're talking about today, it is so much worse than what I've covered in my dry segment.
I think you outlined a lot of these things really, succinctly and started the conversation. Not that the conversation isn't started, but helped bring that into the conversation. And I appreciate the definition of apartheid by international courts. And so that we can all refresh ourselves of what that means and how that can look. And that it doesn't have one particular look.
Mm-hmm. And so much goes on, and I wanted to keep this very academic because that's how my brain can get there.
Yeah, I think a lot about Canada's horrendous history with our Indigenous populations. And
not our Indigenous populations, Laura. They don't belong to Canada.
Well, the Indigenous populations that lived here before my ancestors did. That's a really real mouthful. All I want to say is the Indigenous nations.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. You're not wrong, but...
There's a time for pedantry.
Have you met this podcast?
I catch myself thinking the term Indigenous Canadians sometimes, and then having to correct myself because I'm like, that's not really what I mean, right? Because when you predate the creation of the state of Canada, you're not Indigenous Canadians, you're Indigenous, you can be Canadian citizens anyway.
The point I'm trying to make is all of that applies to the reserve system and the systematic removal of peoples from lands and refusal to compensate until recently, and even then not enough, and having different sets of laws and having the Indian agents allow or not allow people in and out of communities on a whim, if they like you or not, if they're having a good day or not, all of these kinds of things. Sure, there weren't walls per se, but the metaphorical walls were absolutely there.
And they removed their children.
They removed their children. They prevented all of these things. But even if you're thinking of just on a political level with different levels of governments, 100%. Like this is Canada, and we still have remnants of it.
Yeah. And the vast majority of Indigenous people who I've spoken to, as with all groups of people, cultural, ethnic, religious, what have you, nobody's a monolith, and there's a variety of opinions on any number of subjects, obviously. But the vast majority of Indigenous people that I've spoken to don't want, like, other cultures to self-deport or to leave. They want equal rights, and which is not the situation.
Equal rights, equal access.
Yeah.
And many want
reparations.
Well, yes. I was also going to say that, again, it comes down to power in a lot of it. Who has the power? And is it fair that the people who were here at the beginning from time immemorial, again, continue to not have a representative amount of power in the situation.
Yeah.
And that's different than saying, well, yeah, like you say, like, oh, everybody else should leave. And that's just not how humanity works. People are going to arrive, and once someone's there, they're there. In a lot of cases, it's how we interact with one another and who gets to make the decisions about themselves and about other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get to power, we have to go through justice. And not seeing this in any of these situations that we are outlining today. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that reparations are important, I think, both in the context of North America and in the context of Palestine and many other
previously colonized places,
is because certain groups of people have been essentially prevented from building the kind of wealth that is required to function in larger society, the way, unfortunately, we have chosen to structure our society. That kind of familial wealth has been denied certain people. In Canada, primarily Indigenous people and other people of color, and in Palestine, Palestinians have had their property confiscated and their land confiscated and have been barred from any number of things, which locks them into a cycle of poverty and oppression. And you can't have equality and you can't have justice in that kind of circumstance.
Especially if you can't get to the next village over because there's 3 checkpoints and your kids will be beaten if they try to go to school there.
But getting back to what I was talking about you have other people on the land, that you have settler colonists on the land, like the 4 of us. But allowing repatriation of land, allowing right of return, doesn't mean that all of the settlers are going to be like expunged from the land. And the Palestinians that I've spoken to, that's not what they want. Like Ashlyn was saying, they want to live together in peace, and they want equal rights, and they want justice. A lot of times when we talk about freedom for Palestine, people assume that this means that Israel gets wiped off the map in a very literal sense. And I've had people tell me that it means like the murder or massacre of all Jews in the Middle East, which is not true. That's not what anybody here is talking about.
It's horrific and absurd at the same time.
Shall we do something nice? We're going to awkwardly segue into talking about something a little bit brighter. And then we're going to return next month for a discussion of the blockade of Gaza and a discussion of all of this anti-Semitism that is being thrown around.
I want to point out, I know it seems like a hard transition, but one of the podcasts I've been listening to lately talking about these same issues and hosted by mental health professionals, they always open their episodes with asking each other, what brings you joy 3 times? And they talk about how it's important to still have hope and joy and all of that amidst horror. And so while it might be jarring, I think it's important it's okay to still think about something that was nice. I can start.
Please.
Today we took our kids to the local children's amusement park that has a train going round, if you know the name of the town. It is a fun little place for us in our city, and this was the first time we got to go this summer, and it was a nice day. The kids still like it. They haven't outgrown it yet, which is great.
But they have grown sufficiently that they are both now tall enough to ride every ride without necessarily subjecting us to that ride as well.
Yeah, it's
Congratulations.
Pretty sweet to be like, no, you can go on the apples by yourself, love.
I cannot take that spinning. Oh, God.
See, the
God.
apples was one of the only ones my dad would do with us. He liked the apples, yeah.
I can't do spinning.
That's
just
fair.
can't do spinning anymore.
I have never been to local small amusement park. Is the apples the same as a tilt-a-roll?
No, it's like a spinning
Did
teacup
you ever
situation.
have like a large container that you had to like spin the thing in the middle to keep yourself going?
The table.
Yeah.
They're often different fruit shapes.
Yeah, these ones are like the spinning apples. And so that was one of my favorite rides there when I was a kid. I loved it, and my parents would grudgingly go on it with me, or at least my dad would.
And now Mummy's favorite ride is the bench?
Yeah. I went on one ride called Barrel of Monkeys, which was like the spinning apples or the teacups, but also on a pendulum, and the whole ride spun around like those swings.
God.
It was awful. And halfway through, Kira's like, let's change the direction of the spinning. No, you can't. So, my God, I need to get off this thing.
Oh man, they've gotten some new things.
I was not well for many hours, but I want to point out this is still something nice for the day because we had a nice family time, and it's a nice summer tradition to go there. And I'm not mostly, but I'm just happy that they haven't outgrown it and that we can still enjoy it.
Ashlyn, you okay to do something nice?
Sure. I hosted on Saturday a meal that I'm really proud of. I implored my family and friends to help me afford my trip coming up, and I made a very fancy meal, and I served 8 courses to 8 people. It took 2 hours, so I was really pleased with the timing because that's kind of what I was aiming for. That's a good restaurant timing. And I just got a lot of compliments, and our mutual friend Eric, who is a big food nerd, told me how much they enjoyed it and that it was just like going out to a restaurant, and I think that I will ride that high for a long time.
Oh, that's great.
That's pretty good.
Eric is quite the foodie.
Right?
Yeah,
So that's like a huge compliment.
Awesome. Oh, cool.
Yeah, every time they reorder from What's for Dinner, it's like, ooh, Eric ordered.
Ooh, put this on the best of list.
I was really proud of everything we pulled off, and I think we put together a really good meal, and it was not unstressful, but it was also fun.
That's good.
I've said it before, but now I'm going to say it publicly. And I'll use this as part of my something nice as well. The work you've done with the What's for Dinner over the last year has really helped you to organize something this size. You had all of your lists done. You had all of your pre-prep done during the week. Everybody had jobs who was there to have jobs and not just sit there and enjoy, which is totally a job, but those of us who were not sitting down at the table, and it was really stress-free from a helper standpoint. And
That's good.
yeah, even though I didn't do dishes until the next 2 days, because it took 2 days to do all those dishes, we have a apartment-sized dishwasher. So. it was really well done.
My big accomplishment was that even though I was, again, serving 8 courses to 8 people that evening, on Saturday, I did not need anyone to go to the store for me.
Wow.
Not at all.
Right?
That's awesome.
It was
well done.
8 full courses plus breads to start, handmade breads to start, and handmade chocolates to end. So
Oof. That's a lot. Holy smokes. That's so impressive.
A week of cooking. Some chefs do that every night.
Yeah,
for
but they also have
multiple
a
tables.
team.
Yeah.
That
They're not
blows my
doing it a
mind.
single, not that I know you had a lot of help, but like they employ
That's true.
people
They
whose
have
job
many,
it is to
many
chop celery
dollars.
for 8 hours a day. Like that's literally their job.
Yeah.
So just be kind to yourself.
That's fair.
You did more than most chefs do. Most chefs walk in, they do a couple things, and they're like, okay, I'm out. Sous chef, you're on. No offense to all chefs out there. You guys have a lot of talent.
We're making a lot of enemies this
I
episode.
can never. I'm sorry. I just mean it's a team effort, and to try to do a team effort on like on a skeleton crew or single person is
Yeah.
monumental.
And that's why it took so long, just to,
Right.
yeah,
every element had to be made by me or Lauren, essentially.
yeah. I've worked front of house, back of house. They're all horrible people. And I'll stand by that.
yeah, I don't miss the restaurant industry at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, neither do I.
Do you have another something nice, Lauren?
My very silly something nice is, as Jem said at the top of the episode, we're recording this August 28th. I'm looking forward to the Bell Riots in 2 days. So we can maybe start heading to, well, then we got to head toward the really ugly period where people dress like inquisitors.
Yeah.
And then we
What?
get world peace.
What are you talking about?
World peace doesn't start until the Vulcans show up.
That's true.
There's the unification of Ireland in there, too, I'm told.
Although the current Irish Prime Minister has said the unification in 2024 is not happening.
Seems likely at this point, yeah.
Lauren's face.
It's some Star Trek bullshit, don't worry.
Like, did I suddenly teleport to a different podcast? Am I in Bizarro World?
That's what happened to make the crew of the Voyager end up in 2024. Yes.
The crew of the Voyager? 22? No. It was
Let's say that
it was
again. Oh my God. That's what happened to make
crew of
the
the
crew of the Defiant, part of Deep Space Nine, end up in 2024.
Oh my God. Oh.
We married these people, Laura.
Why did we do that?
Sex. Really good sex.
No.
Whoa! Okay!
Shots fired!
Like,
One person got caught in the crossfire here. I was not involved.
What's your something nice, Jen?
I know what it isn't.
Anyway.
My something nice is I bought myself a little present. I bought myself a Miu Mini Plus, which is like a handheld little video game console that plays emulators. So I have been finally playing Chrono Trigger,
Oh.
a game that when I was in, I guess, middle school, I'd always wanted to play, and I never did. And yeah, it's fun so far.
I think Dave is currently playing that during long, boring nights at work on his phone.
Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger.
nice. And of course, Jem bought this solely for himself, right? The kids have taken over every other gaming system. So he's like, this one's mine. He tells the kids. Huxley is insistent on playing on it every chance that Jem has it out. Can I have a turn? Can I have a turn? Can I have a turn? Poor Jem never gets a chance.
Here's the Switch, baby.
Fine. I'm bad at sticking to my guns.
Yeah, you are.
It's my video game system, but okay.
Yeah. It's mine. It's not yours, children. Give it back in an hour. Okay, you're not done with it. Okay.
Well, thanks for joining me tonight, everybody.
Thank you.
It's felt like a longer episode than it has been, but we'll be back next month to talk a little bit more about Israel and Palestine. In the meantime, be kind to each other. Good night.
Take care of
Night.
yourselves.
Good night.
Good night.
Show notes and references for all of our episodes are available at lueepodcast.com, where you can also find links to donate or get in touch. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is with a review on Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you found us, or by sharing this episode with a friend.